weird kind of way, actually, what I'm going to read tonight dovetails nicely with a couple of Nuala's poems. Obviously from the male end of the spectrum, but you'll see how you'll see what I'm talking about. I'm more nervous than I normally would be at one of these things, because as you can see, I just have sheets of paper, not published work in front of me. Because I decided I would, I'd like to read to you from, I suppose what writers call work in progress. Something that comes to the end, which I don't even have a publisher for, so I'm also breaking that rule of superstition that I'm immediately putting a hex on it by reading it in public before it's been published. But I don't have a publisher for it, but I'll be looking for one very soon now. But I did want to read it because this is the ideal audience for it, and you'll see why. It's the first time I've attempted really to write something set in the past, and I suppose what interested me most of all about doing this was to attempt to be in that past. I suppose one of the things you can do in a novel, if you do it right, and it's what I've been attempting to do, is to not be somebody in the 21st century looking back in that past, but actually be in it and let the reader feel that they're in it also. It's not that far in the past. It's the novel basically takes place throughout the decade of the 60s, so from 1959 to 1969. This is from very early on, and you'll recognise a few places. So any of you in your 50s will be greater experts than I on this matter, and you might have comments to make. It's a long passage, so there may be no time for me to read anything else from it, but if you want, I might be able to. But this is a long passage, so bear with me. The novel is tentatively called Unspoken, by the way. The contractions were much more frequent and painful, but Anne didn't mind that. This was pain she remembered from before and knew how it would end. Anyway, now she was safe in her narrow, spotless white cubicle. Mr. Carr, the gynaecologist, had been phoned as Anne requested, and Mrs. Lynch told her that he sent his best wishes and was standing by at a moment's notice if needed. Mrs. Lynch smiled and told Anne there was little likelihood there'd be any need for Mr. Carr to be bothering himself. Everything was going to be fine. Anne knew that now. The panic of a couple of hours ago and the terrors of the last few months had disappeared. It had been worth every penny she saved to have this peace of mind. Her baby would be fine. Everyone said Mrs. Lynch was the best. A woman as vibrant and healthy as you would have no bother at all. Mrs. Lynch leaned in a little closer and dropped her voice, as if to make sure that no one else heard. It pleased Anne that the most revered midwife in the city seemed to be confiding in her. I wish I could say the same for some of the rest of them here tonight. But I will manage them all anyway with the help of God. You'll be the least of my worries, Mrs. Rowe. Anne was thrilled to hear such praise. She hated being a bother to anyone. Judging by moans from the other cubicles, it seemed that Mrs. Lynch had quite a few other women about to give birth. Yet here she was, her hand on Anne's stomach, pressing confidently, taking time to make sure that everything was as it should be. Mrs. Lynch, her head turned a little as if listening closely, hearing things that the normal run of humanity could not, waited in stillness and utter silence until the next contraction came. Anne's breath quickened, but she tried to be as brave and calm as possible. Mrs. Lynch smiled. Good for you. Be a few hours yet. We'll look in again in a while. Is that all right? That's fine, Mrs. Lynch. The smell of cleaning fluids was so overpowering in the tiny, scrubbed waiting room that Fonzie knew he didn't need to worry about any of the other fathers-to-be catching a whiff of swarfiga from him. The others, sitting close together on the wooden benches, nodded and muttered greetings, then returned to silence as Fonzie sat and clasped his hands on his lap. After a few moments, he shifted them to his side. Then he folded his arms, making the hands virtually invisible. Though it was clear that no one was even looking in his direction, he couldn't help feeling a little self-conscious. It was obvious to him that none of the other men worked with their hands. Soft faces, too. Fonzie didn't recognise any of them, even to see, and from the lack of any conversation, it seemed that no one else knew each other either. A different kind of man might have considered the curious coincidence of time, place, and event that brought 5 strangers together like this, and how soon, in one way or another, each of their lives would be changed. But Fonzie Strong did not have such thoughts. His only passing reflection was mildly surprised that they were all strangers, but guessed that if they started talking, some connection would be established very quickly, as was always the way in a city that wasn't much more than a town. He, however, would never be the one to begin such a conversation. Instead, arms folded, he stared at the door, hoping someone would come soon and let him know how Anne was doing. The young man directly opposite Fancy, Brendan Barry, sat quite still, apart from occasionally flicking his blonde fringe back from his eyes. He didn't recognise himself in any of these other men. They were all much older, of course, but it wasn't just that. It still felt like a bit of a shock to be here at all. Brendan had grown used to being the kind of young man that girls looked at in a certain way, although he never analysed why. He just enjoyed the attention and the kisses. Others might have told him he possessed a charming combination of delicate good looks, genuine politeness, and a strangely alluring passivity of manner, qualities that also served him well as a trainee hotel manager. It was while on duty in Cruise's Hotel almost 9 months ago, not long after his 20th birthday, that he encountered Elizabeth Flanagan. Her parents were hosting a private function to celebrate their silver jubilee. He'd already noticed the young girl notice him as soon as she walked into the hotel. Her dancing eyes, short-cropped hair and slim frame reminded Brendan of Leslie Caron. Later, when he wheeled a trolley with cake and champagne into the party, he felt her gaze follow him, so it was no surprise that later she slipped out and hung around the lobby hoping to bump into him. Of course he enjoyed flirting with her. Of course he could have just laughed off as a joke her suggestion that he steal a key to an unoccupied room. And of course, even after they kissed in the darkness of room 35, he could have resisted going all the way. But in the pleasure of the adventure, the thrill of the secret encounter, it was hard to stop himself. Young Elizabeth Flanagan definitely didn't want him to stop. Anyway, it had been a great laugh. As a particular favour, the marriage service was arranged in great haste by a close friend. Father Connolly, parish priest at the Mother of Good Hope Church on the north side of the road. Circumstances had made Brendan Barry from Garryowen a grudgingly acceptable Flanagan son-in-law, the birth of a healthy child in wedlock being the first priority for everybody involved in this awkward situation. His father-in-law bought a brand new semi-detached house in Corbally and opened a generous current account to take care of household bills. Both the house and the account were in Elizabeth's name only. The insult didn't really bother Brendan. The Flanagan family could not organise all things, however. They had prayed that Elizabeth might be sufficiently overdue to allow them to create the impression in their circle that the birth was respectably premature. But nature had thwarted them. Now that the moment had arrived several days early, as it happened, and quite definitely less than 7 months since the wedding, Brendan still did not know exactly what his true feelings were. The force of Elizabeth's passion for him could still be exciting. He regretted none of the rampant pleasure of their escapade, nor its consequences, and he was quite giddy at the notion of becoming a father. But what lay beyond now seemed more complicated and difficult, duller too, maybe. His knee briefly touched the man on his left. They both shifted position immediately, silently. This man, Cormac Kiley, was the most placidly contented of those who sat waiting, perhaps because it was his 7th time being there. An architect, as his father had been, he was happy to continue many of the practices that had proved successful in earlier difficult times. A carefully maintained relationship with the bishop meant he was the first to be called on by the diocese for their many building projects. This relationship had become the core of his business, but he and his wife Louise, insofar as so many joyful pregnancies allowed, also involved themselves enthusiastically in local society, the Lions Club, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, Castletroy Golf Club and the Sicilian Musical Society. That pleasure and profit should flow equally from such pleasant social interactions was something Cormac continually gave thanks for, as he gave thanks for each of the 6 vigils he had undergone in this same waiting room, itself part of an extension to St. Gerard's that he had designed. His wife swore by Mrs. Lynch, and there had been no mishaps yet. Of course, a new baby meant that Louise could not now play any part in Sicilian's autumn production of The Merry Widow.